The US/NATO response would be dependent on a lot of things. I mean, it would depend on how Russia launched them. It would depend on where the missiles struck. It would depend on how many missiles are we talking about. Hell, it even would depend on what Russia was signaling. And what I mean by what Russia was signaling is that's probably the first step Russia would take, is they would start signaling to the U.S. that they're serious about nuclear weapons by actually truly elevating their nuclear posture, by loading missiles into tubes, putting them nearer to the front line, getting them ready for launch. Now, Putin last year, before the war started, said he was elevating his nuclear posture. That was just rhetoric. There was no actual physical movements of nuclear weapons. The U.S. didn't observe any changes in their actual nuclear posture. It was just signaling to the West to stay away from Russia and Ukraine when this war kicked off. They did the same thing before Crimea, and nothing really came of it. But Russia does have a nuclear doctrine with escalation points, and he could actually escalate that to their nuclear forces to a higher level, which would pose a serious threat, or at least serious consideration from the West, and more than likely the response would be something more bolstering the posture of forces in Europe for NATO, and also potentially matching his elevation with an elevation of our own nuclear forces to tell him we're serious about a potential nuclear strike into a NATO territory. But obviously this would be aimed at Ukraine. Sanctions would come about, et cetera, et cetera. But let's say Russia is crazy enough and stupid enough to actually press the button. Still, there'd be some things that are factors that the U.S. and NATO would have to consider before responding. First and foremost would be, where was the nuclear weapons launched? Was it launched from Russia's mainland? Was it launched from sea-bearing vessels in the Black Sea? Was it a tactical nuclear weapon that was 50 kilotons or less? Was it a strategic nuclear weapon and they hit a major city, they hit the battlefield, etc.? I don't think it necessarily means we immediately go into a nuclear exchange, like I've said before. I think because NATO and the U.S. conventional forces are so overwhelmingly powerful relative to Russia's that it's not necessary. But Russia has options. So Russia could hit Bakhmut on the battlefield, like I made my last video about, to try and turn that battlefield in Russia's favor. But as I said before, if you're going to launch a nuclear weapon and strike somewhere in Ukraine, you might as well just go for broke and hit Kyiv with one of your strategic nuclear weapons. Again, I just don't think that's going to happen. So Russia likes to escalate incrementally. The incremental escalation could be potentially detonating a nuclear weapon over the Black Sea in what would be the coastal waters of Ukraine. So potentially in their coastal territory that they would claim, or potentially Russia would detonate it in a relatively uninhabited portion of Ukraine. Unfortunately, a series of farms would be destroyed, but it would signal that Russia is serious and now is crossing the line, and they will use nuclear weapons, potentially to get the West and the U.S. to back off. Again, I don't think that would happen because the West has continuously signaled that a nuclear strike is an absolute red line. And actually, China has signaled that as well, where they said that any use of nuclear weapons would be unacceptable. So yet another reason why I just don't think Russia would do it. In fact, India would likely back away from Russia as well, as not necessarily a supporter, but just as someone who is kind of turning a blind eye to what Russia is doing. So let's say the nuclear strike hits anywhere, whatever. It could be in the coastal waters. If it launches from ships in the Black Sea, more than likely the vessel that launched that missile would be struck by NATO forces. NATO would get involved. If you're going to drop nuclear weapons, that is immediate cause for potential world-ending catastrophe. So NATO would absolutely get involved. And then when NATO got involved, China would immediately go, we're not a part of this. This is y'all's to handle. China doesn't want any of that smoke whatsoever. They would back off, and the U.S. will basically tell China to go fuck itself in its corner over there until this is all finished. And then if you supplied anything to them, we'll deal with you later. But that's not happening yet. Like I said, China will want to be a part of the rebuild later on. And to do that, they just have to back off. So let's say it comes from a ship. More than likely, the Black Sea Fleet or that vessel by itself would be sunk. And we would potentially see war between Russia and NATO. And that's the way it goes. I mean, like I said, nuclear weapons change the calculus of how this war is on a trajectory, because and Putin knows this. That's why it hasn't happened yet. He knows that nuclear weapons have such a connotation that it would almost force the hand of the international community to do something. But let's say the missiles were launched from some ground-based launch system. Now, if we could determine where it was and immediately respond, we would probably destroy the ground-based systems, destroy all the systems that support that ground-based system with our aircraft, cruise missiles, etc. We would respond by destroying the platforms that did it, and then more than likely, just to cut the shit at this point, we would significantly increase our assistance to include probably adding troops on the ground to Ukraine to drive Russia out of Ukraine. But again, I don't think that would cause us to suddenly roll across the border, take Moscow, take St. Petersburg. I think it would be a conventional, overwhelmingly conventional response that Russia would not be able to defeat to a nuclear strike by eliminating the capability of Russia to do it again, at least from the platforms they had used before. They probably would still have access to their strategic nuclear weapons, largely because attacking those would elicit a strategic nuclear response from Russia. So more than likely what would happen is whatever platform or unit or fleet launched it, they would just be destroyed by NATO. NATO would enter Ukraine and drive Russia out. And then once Russia's driven out, peace talks and negotiations would happen, and we'll go from there. It would be on Russia to once again re-escalate by increasing more nuclear strikes, in which case at that point it would be clear that we are in World War III. And I don't even know if it'd be World War III, because the assumption that it would be a world war came from the fact that Germany had other countries on its side. It had Italy. It was, for a while there, it had Russia on its side. Then Russia switched sides. I mean, it had other countries were involved. Japan was on its side, whereas Russia would largely be alone. So, I mean, you'd have probably Belarus, but they would only go because they would be dragged into the war. Has nothing to do with an alliance that they would really want. Every other potential supporter, whether it be China, India, Iran, North Korea, they would all go, oh shit, this is a fucking shitstorm, Putin started, and back off. And I just think it would be NATO versus Russia, not World War III. Yeah, NATO versus Russia is a lot of countries, so it's a good chunk of the world, but that's a war Russia loses 10 out of 10 times. So that's what I think. That's how I think the response would play out. Wouldn't be an immediate nuclear exchange, but there you go.